In 1973, Sears, Roebuck and Company opened the tallest building on Earth. 110 stories of black steel and bronze-tinted glass rising 1,450 feet over Chicago, built at a cost of $150 million for the sole purpose of housing the employees of what was, at that moment, the largest and richest retailer the world had ever seen. Annual revenue had crossed $8 billion. 350,000 people drew Sears paychecks. 2 out of every 3 American households carried a Sears credit card. Half the homes in the country had a Kenmore appliance in the kitchen. And the company that owned all of it, the stores, the brands, the insurance company, the catalog that reached into every rural mailbox from Maine to Montana, looked up at this tower and saw a future so expansive they needed the tallest building in the world just to hold the paperwork. 15 years later, they sold it. Today, the building still stands. It's called the Willis Tower now. And as of late 2025, Sears has 5 stores left. The distance between those two facts, the tallest building in the world and 5 remaining stores, is the story. And it starts with a shipment of watches that nobody wanted. In 1886, a 22-year-old railroad station agent named Richard Warren Sears was working at a depot in North Redwood, Minnesota, earning about $50 a month. The job was quiet enough that he'd already started side businesses selling coal and lumber to supplement his income. His father, a blacksmith and wagon maker, had lost the family's savings in a bad stock venture and died shortly afterward, leaving young Richard to support his mother and sisters. He was, by nature, a hustler, not in the dishonest sense, but in the tireless, inventive, always looking for the angle sense. The angle found him. A jeweler in town refused delivery on a shipment of gold-filled pocket watches sent by a wholesaler. Rather than pay to ship them back, Sears talked the wholesaler into letting him sell them himself, keeping whatever he could get above $12 per watch. He offered them to fellow station agents along the rail line for $14 apiece. Watches, at that moment in American history, were not just accessories. The growth of railroads and the recent introduction of standardized time zones meant that farmers and railroad men suddenly needed to keep accurate time. Sears had stumbled onto a product that the infrastructure of his own employer demanded. Within 6 months, he had made $5,000, roughly $160,000 in today's money, and quit the railroad. He moved to Minneapolis and founded the R.W. Sears Watch Company, renting a small office for $10 a month. His desk was a kitchen table. His chair cost 50 cents. But the man had a genius for advertising copy that borders on the uncanny for someone with no formal training. He placed ads in farm publications and wrote flyers that spoke directly to rural Americans in plain, personal language, as though he were a neighbor leaning over the fence. Orders poured in. He moved to Chicago in 1887 to be closer to the nation's shipping and communications hub, and placed a classified ad in the Chicago Daily News, "Wanted, watchmaker with reference who can furnish tools." Alva Curtis Roebuck, a 22-year-old self-taught watchmaker from Indiana, answered the ad and was hired 2 days later. The partnership that would name the company was formed over a workbench and a pile of broken watches. By 1893, the firm was formally named Sears, Roebuck and Company, and the first catalog, initially just watches, had begun expanding into clothing, plows, silverware, bicycles, and sporting goods. By 1897, it was 500 pages thick and reaching 300,000 homes. Richard Sears wrote most of the copy himself, and he was, by all accounts, a natural. The tone was warm, conversational, almost conspiratorial, as though a trusted neighbor were tipping you off to a deal the local merchant didn't want you to know about. "We solicit honest criticism more than orders," one edition declared. The catalog carried titles like The Book of Bargains and The Great Price Maker. It wasn't just selling goods. It was teaching millions of rural Americans how to be modern consumers, how to read product specifications, how to compare prices, how to place an order, and what to expect when it arrived. And what it sold was, eventually, everything. Sewing machines and saddles, cream separators and corsets, stoves and shotguns, patent medicines and pianos. By the early 1900s, you could order a complete prefabricated house from the Sears catalog, the lumber, the hardware, the plumbing, the paint, even the nails, shipped by rail in 2 boxcars ready to assemble. Between 1908 and 1940, Sears sold an estimated 70,000 kit homes across the country. Some of them are still standing, still lived in, still structurally sound a century later. The catalog didn't just deliver products to rural America. It delivered the 20th century itself. The products of industrial manufacturing made available for the first time to people who lived miles from the nearest store. Richard Sears understood something that would take other retailers decades to learn. Rural Americans, who made up roughly 2/3 of the country's population, were being systematically overcharged by local merchants who faced no competition. A farmer in Nebraska had no choice but to pay whatever the general store asked. Sears undercut them all, buying discontinued lines and surplus inventory from manufacturers and passing the discount to the customer. The Rural Free Delivery Act of 1896, which expanded mail routes into remote areas, functioned as a government subsidy for his entire business model. One colleague reportedly remarked that Sears could probably sell a breath of air. But Richard Sears was not a manager. He was a promoter, a writer of catalog copy, a man who ran on instinct and nerve. And the bigger the company got, the more it needed something else. That something arrived in 1895 in the form of a 32-year-old Chicago clothing manufacturer named Julius Rosenwald. Rosenwald, the son of German-Jewish immigrants, had grown up in Springfield, Illinois, 1 block from Abraham Lincoln's house. He'd dropped out of high school to apprentice with his uncles in the New York garment trade, and by his early 30s, he'd built a modest but profitable business making men's suits. When Alva Roebuck, overwhelmed by the pace and stressed by the finances, sold his share of the company, Rosenwald's brother-in-law, Aaron Nussbaum, introduced him to Richard Sears. Rosenwald invested $37,500 in cash for a quarter stake. It was, by any measure, the most consequential investment in the history of American retail. Where Sears was instinct, Rosenwald was system. He imposed order on the shipping room chaos. He built inventory controls. He instituted a policy of unconditional refunds, a radical idea at the time, because he understood that trust, once established with a customer who would never see your face, was the single most valuable thing a mail-order company could possess. Under Rosenwald's management, annual sales climbed to roughly $50 million by 1907, but the panic of that year revealed a fundamental tension between the two partners. Richard Sears wanted to keep expanding, to pour money into bigger catalogs and more advertising. Rosenwald, the organizer, argued for consolidation, for making sure the company could actually fulfill the orders that Richard Sears' brilliant copy was generating. The rift never fully healed. The following year, Richard Sears resigned the presidency due to declining health. He was 44. He retired to his farm north of Chicago and died in 1914, leaving an estate valued at around $25 million. The company that bore his name would grow far beyond anything he had imagined, but it would do so under the direction of the man who had bought in for $37,500. Rosenwald, now in full control, did something that would seem almost unthinkable from a modern CEO. He created one of the first employee profit-sharing and pension plans in American corporate history, funding it with millions of dollars worth of his own Sears stock. Most business leaders thought he was insane. Rosenwald disagreed. He believed that having money meant you needed to use it responsibly. Over his lifetime, he would give away more than $60 million, roughly $1 billion in today's money, to causes including the Museum of Science and Industry in Chicago, and, most consequentially, the construction of nearly 5,000 schools for black children across the segregated South. Built in partnership with Booker T. Washington and the Tuskegee Institute. He kept his name off almost all of it. But Rosenwald's most audacious act came during the post-World War I recession, when plunging farm prices devastated Sears's rural customer base. In 1921, the company posted a loss of $16 million and omitted its dividend for the first time. Rosenwald responded by pledging $21 million of his personal fortune, the equivalent of roughly $280 million today, in a combination of gifts and loans to stabilize the company. He slashed his own salary. He donated 50,000 shares from his personal holdings to reduce outstanding capital stock and restore Sears' credit. The company survived. And in the broader arc of the story, this moment matters for a reason that won't be fully clear for another 80 years. It was the last time anyone in control of Sears would sacrifice personal wealth to save it. Meanwhile, the foundation of Sears' next great transformation was already being laid. In 1906, Rosenwald had overseen the construction of a massive new headquarters on Chicago's West Side, a 40-acre complex at Homan Avenue and Arthington Street with 3 million square feet of floor space spread across 7 interconnected buildings. It was, at the time, one of the largest commercial structures in the world. The same year, Goldman Sachs and Lehman Brothers underwrote Sears' initial public offering, a $40 million stock placement that was one of the first major retail IPOs in American financial history. The company even had its own radio station, WLS, broadcasting from a tower atop the complex. The call letters stood for World's Largest Store. The Homan Avenue plant could process and ship orders within a single day, by rail, to anywhere in the country. 9,000 employees worked there at the outset. By the 1920s, that number would swell past 20,000. But by then, the catalog model was facing an existential threat. Americans were moving to cities. They were buying automobiles. A farmer who could drive to town no longer needed to wait 6 weeks for a package. The rural customer base that had built Sears was migrating out from under it. The company needed someone who could see where America was heading and get there first. That someone was Robert Elkington Wood, a retired Army brigadier general who had overseen supply logistics for the construction of the Panama Canal. Wood had joined Sears' rival, Montgomery Ward, in 1919. But was fired after clashing with Ward's leadership over his insistence that the company needed to open physical retail stores. Sears hired him in 1924. It was the best personnel decision the company ever made. Wood turned to the U.S. Census and the statistical abstract of the United States the way a general turns to terrain maps. He saw the population shifting from farm to city and from city to suburb. And he saw the automobile turning that shift into a stampede. His plan: follow the customers with stores, not downtown department stores competing with Marshall Field's and John Wanamaker's, but freestanding stores on cheap land, on the outskirts of cities with ample parking, selling the practical goods that working and middle-class families actually needed: tires, tools, appliances, work clothes. The first Sears retail store opened on February 2, 1925, inside the existing Homan Avenue complex. By 1928, Wood was opening 138 new stores in a single year. By 1929, Sears operated more than 300 stores, and retail sales had overtaken catalog revenue for the first time. The company that had been built for the era of the horse and the post office had reinvented itself for the era of the automobile and the suburb. And it kept reinventing. In 1931, Sears founded Allstate Insurance Company, a name chosen reportedly from a Sears tire brand, and began selling auto insurance through its catalog and later through booths inside its stores. In 1927, it had introduced the Craftsman brand for hand tools. Kenmore appliances followed. DieHard batteries arrived in 1967. These weren't just products. They were promises. A Craftsman wrench came with a lifetime warranty. A Kenmore washing machine was what your mother had, and her mother before her. DieHard was the battery you bought because you'd been stranded once and swore you'd never be stranded again. Sears didn't just sell merchandise. It sold reliability to people who couldn't afford to be wrong. Through the Depression, which the company navigated by championing thrift and selling staples rather than luxuries, the store count nearly doubled. After World War II, still under Wood's leadership, Sears expanded into the booming new shopping centers sprouting across suburban America, becoming the anchor tenant that gave a mall its commercial gravity. By the mid-1950s, there were more than 700 Sears stores in the United States. The company expanded into Mexico in 1947 and Canada in 1952. By 1975, Sears, J.C. Penney, and Montgomery Ward together captured 43% of all department store sales in the country. Sears alone, through the 1960s and into the 1970s, was the largest retailer on earth. An estimated 1 in 5 Americans, more than 50 million people, had worked for Sears at some point in their lives. And the catalog hadn't gone away, it had evolved. In 1933, Sears issued its first Christmas catalog, the Wish Book, featuring Mickey Mouse watches, Lionel electric train sets, and record players. By 1968, when it was officially renamed, the Wish Book ran to 600 pages. For millions of American children, the arrival of the Wish Book in late August was the unofficial start of the holiday season. You sat on the floor with a crayon and circled everything you wanted, and your parents translated those circles into layaway plans at the local Sears store. The Wish Book was not merely commerce, it was ritual. It was anticipation made tangible, a fat, glossy object that landed on the doorstep and promised that the future would contain good things. At its peak, Sears mailed roughly 15 million catalogs annually. The catalog operation alone was a $3 to $4 billion a year business. Profit margins on catalog sales ran in the range of 12 to 18%, excellent for retail. This was, in every meaningful sense, the direct-to-consumer infrastructure of the 20th century. The company had become something more than a business. It was an institution, as embedded in the rhythms of American life as the post office or the public school. The Sears Roebuck Foundation had been underwriting Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood on PBS since the show's premiere in 1968. Sears had been a component of the Dow Jones Industrial Average since 1924. Its stock traded under the single-letter ticker symbol S on the New York Stock Exchange, a mark of prestige reserved for the most established companies in the country. And then, in 1970, at the apex of all of this, Sears decided to build a tower. The logic was straightforward. The company needed to consolidate its 13,000 Chicago area office workers under one roof. Architects from Skidmore, Owings, and Merrill were commissioned. The structural engineer, Fazlur Rahman Khan, designed an innovative bundled tube system, 9 steel tubes clustered in a 3x3 grid, with tubes dropping off at different heights, creating the building's distinctive stepped silhouette. Ground was broken in August 1970. By May 1973, the structure had surpassed the World Trade Center to become the tallest building in the world. The construction cost about $150 million. Enough concrete was poured to build an 8-lane highway 5 miles long. 28 acres of black anodized aluminum panels wrapped the facade. It was magnificent. It was also, in hindsight, a monument to the exact moment when Sears stopped looking forward. Because while the company was pouring concrete, 3 discount retailers, Target, Kmart, and Walmart, all founded in the same year, 1962, were quietly eating into Sears' customer base from below. And traditional department stores like Nordstrom and Bloomingdale's were pulling wealthier shoppers away from above. Sears was caught in the middle. Too expensive for the price-conscious, too unglamorous for the style-conscious. The company that had always known where Americans were heading had stopped reading the map. The response, when it came, was breathtaking in its ambition and catastrophic in its misdirection. In 1981, under Chairman Edward Telling, Sears acquired the brokerage firm Dean Witter Reynolds for approximately $600 million and the real estate giant Coldwell Banker for about $179 million. The vision: Sears would become a one-stop financial supermarket. You'd walk into a Sears store, buy a washing machine, open a brokerage account, get your house appraised, and insure your car, all under one roof. Sears already had Allstate. Now it had stocks, bonds, mortgages, and real estate. The pitch to the board was seductive. Sears had 25 million credit card customers and 854 retail stores blanketing the country. Dean Witter and Coldwell Banker could use that footprint to expand into markets they'd never reached. In 1985, the company introduced the Discover Card, which offered cashback rewards, a first in the industry. Within 4 years, 20 million Americans carried one. Wall Street skeptics coined the phrase that would haunt the strategy: socks and stocks. Do consumers really want to buy socks and stocks under the same roof? Stockholders wondered why Sears was pouring hundreds of millions into financial services when its core retail business was being assaulted by Walmart and every other discounter in America. The answer was that Sears leadership had looked at the trajectory of the retail business, seen a fight they weren't sure they could win, and decided to build an entirely different company around the store network. It was a bet that the Sears brand, the trust built over a century of selling reliable goods to ordinary Americans, could transfer to insurance policies and mutual funds. The bet was wrong, but it wasn't crazy. What was damaging was the distraction. For the better part of a decade, the most powerful retailer in America was focused on becoming a bank. Meanwhile, the core retail business, the stores, the catalog, the brands that had made Sears what it was, continued to deteriorate. The stores were aging, the merchandise stale. In 1992, California's Department of Consumer Affairs caught Sears Auto Centers systematically recommending unnecessary repairs to customers, charging for brake jobs and alignments that weren't needed. The scandal made national news and triggered investigations in more than 40 states. It was a devastating blow to a company whose entire identity was built on being the store you could trust. By 1991, Walmart had surpassed Sears as the nation's largest retailer. In 1992, Sears posted a staggering loss of $3.9 billion, the largest in the history of North American retailing. The company had lost its footing in every direction at once, losing customers to discounters, losing prestige to department stores, losing focus to the financial services experiment, and losing money on the catalog, which was hemorrhaging between $135 and $175 million a year. The company that had once defined American retail was now the cautionary example everyone else pointed to. The man who arrived to stop the bleeding was Arthur C. Martinez, a former Saks Fifth Avenue executive brought in to run the Sears Merchandise Group in 1992. Martinez was an outsider, the first in the company's history to hold a top leadership position. And he acted with the urgency of a surgeon who knows the patient is dying. On January 25, 1993, he announced the most sweeping restructuring in Sears' 100-year history. 113 stores would close, 50,000 workers would be terminated, and the Sears catalog, the big book, the 900-page volume that had been the company's reason for existing since 1893, would be discontinued. The catalog was losing money. By the early 1990s, the cost of printing and mailing a 1,500-page book to millions of households, filled with low-margin products, had made the business unprofitable. It was reportedly losing as much as $1 million a day. Martinez's reasoning was cold, clear, and defensible. The catalog was a drag on earnings, and Sears needed to focus on its stores, or it would cease to exist. And so, on that January day, a century of direct-to-customer infrastructure, the mailing lists, the distribution networks, the fulfillment systems, the intimate knowledge of what 15 million American households bought and when they bought it, was dismantled. A year and a half later, in July 1994, a former hedge fund analyst named Jeff Bezos incorporated a company in the state of Washington. He called it Amazon. The irony is so precise it almost doesn't feel real. Sears had spent a century perfecting the exact business that Amazon would use to conquer the world. A centralized operation that shipped goods directly to customers' homes based on orders placed remotely from a catalog. The catalog was the internet before there was an internet. The distribution network was Amazon's logistics before Amazon existed. Sears didn't just have the infrastructure, it had the customer data, the purchasing histories of 15 million households built up over decades of catalog sales, the brand trust, the purchasing relationships with thousands of manufacturers, and the name recognition in every household in America. It even had the wish book, which functioned almost exactly the way Amazon's holiday toy catalog would function 25 years later, right down to children circling items with crayons. Amazon now sends over 30 million of those catalogs annually. What Sears lacked was not capability but imagination, the willingness to see that what it was killing was not a money-losing relic, but a platform waiting for a new technology. When Sears finally launched an e-commerce site in 1997, it had to rebuild its distribution infrastructure from scratch. The mailing lists were gone. The fulfillment systems had been dismantled. The muscle memory of a century of direct-to-customer commerce had atrophied in 4 years. Martinez didn't make a stupid decision. He made a reasonable decision that happened to be exactly wrong at exactly the worst possible moment. Martinez, to his credit, did stabilize the company. He spun off Dean Witter and Discover to shareholders, sold Coldwell Banker, and in 1995 oversaw the spin-off of Allstate Insurance. The pieces that Sears had bolted on during the financial services experiment were worth more apart than together, a fact the stock market acknowledged immediately. Sears stock, which had languished in the mid-teens during the worst of the crisis, climbed past $50 a share. Martinez launched the "Come See the Softer Side of Sears" advertising campaign, attempting to reposition the stores as destinations for women's apparel and home furnishings rather than just Craftsman tools and DieHard batteries. By 1995, revenue had risen to $35 billion, with profit hitting a record $1.8 billion. For a brief window, it looked like Sears might survive as a focused, modernized department store chain. But the window was already closing. The stores were aging. The brand still carried the scent of hardware and motor oil, no matter how many advertisements featured women in blouses. Fashion brands didn't want to be associated with Sears. J.C. Penney and Macy's pressured vendors not to sell through a competitor so far down market. And the company, having killed the catalog and sold the financial services businesses, no longer had any distinctive competitive advantage. It was just another department store chain, fighting for the same middle-class customer against competitors who were either cheaper or more appealing. In 1988, 5 years before the catalog ended, Sears had already sold the Tower. The naming rights were retained until 2003, but the company began moving its headquarters to a new campus in Hoffman Estates, Illinois, a suburb 30 miles northwest of the Loop. The Homan Avenue complex, the 40-acre birthplace of the company, was gradually redeveloped into affordable housing, a community center, and a high school. The massive merchandise building, the 3 million square foot structure that had once been the largest commercial building in the world, was demolished, though its 14-story tower still stands, now renamed the Nichols Tower and repurposed as a community space. Where 9,000 workers once opened envelopes containing orders from farmers in North Dakota, children now attend after-school programs. The final chapter began in 2003 when a hedge fund manager named Edward Lampert started buying Kmart stock. Kmart, one of those 1962 discount chains that had helped erode Sears' customer base, had filed for bankruptcy in 2002. Lampert, who ran a fund called ESL Investments, named for his own initials, had earned a reputation as a brilliant value investor. He'd grown up on Long Island, the son of a successful lawyer. When his father died of a heart attack, Lampert was 14, and his mother took a job as a sales clerk at Saks Fifth Avenue to keep the family afloat. The boy learned about the stock market from his grandmother, devouring corporate reports while his classmates played sports. He studied economics at Yale under Nobel laureate James Tobin, was tapped for the Skull and Bones Society, then worked briefly at Goldman Sachs before launching his fund in 1988 at the age of 25 with $28 million, backed primarily by Texas billionaire Richard Rainwater. Early wins in IBM, American Express, and AutoZone had delivered annualized returns of roughly 25% for more than a decade. Some in the press called him the next Warren Buffett. Lampert acquired Kmart out of bankruptcy for about $1.5 billion. The stock soared. By the end of 2004, ESL's combined stake in Kmart and Sears had grown to $5.7 billion from an initial investment of $1.5 billion. Then, in late 2004, he announced the move that would define the rest of the Sears story. Kmart would acquire Sears in a deal valued at $11 billion, creating the third largest retailer in America. On paper, it was a merger. In practice, it was a financial engineer taking control of a 112-year-old retailer and managing it like a portfolio of assets. The unstated logic, which Wall Street understood, even if it was never said aloud, even if the retail business continued to decline, the real estate underneath 3,400 Sears and Kmart stores was worth a fortune. Lampert became chairman. He controlled nearly 40% of the combined company's stock, and he ran it unlike any retailer had ever been run. He restructured Sears Holdings into dozens of separate business units: shoes, menswear, home furnishings, appliances, each with its own president, its own board, and its own profit and loss statement, competing against one another for resources. The idea was borrowed from the hedge fund world. Internal competition would drive efficiency. In practice, it drove chaos. Departments hoarded information, refused to cooperate, and fought over floor space. The stores, already showing their age, received almost no capital investment. Shelves were sparse, ceilings leaked, fitting rooms were grimy, customers noticed. What Lampert did invest in was financial engineering. Between 2005 and 2012, Sears Holdings poured approximately $6 billion into stock buybacks, temporarily boosting the share price. The company took on billions in debt, much of it lent by Lampert's own entities. ESL Investments owned roughly 40% of Sears' debt load, meaning Lampert and his fund collected interest payments from the company Lampert ran. In 2015, he spun off 266 properties into a real estate investment trust called Seritage Growth Properties, collecting rent on stores that Sears continued to operate. Critics called it asset stripping. Lampert called it unlocking value. The combined profits Sears Holdings earned peaked at $1.5 billion in 2006, the year after the merger. After that, sales declined every single year. The human cost was enormous. At the time of the Sears-Kmart merger, the combined company had roughly 300,000 employees. Stores closed by the hundreds. By 2018, 175,000 of those jobs had been eliminated. The stores that remained were often unrecognizable: half-empty floors, flickering lights, disheartened employees in threadbare uniforms. Customers who had shopped at Sears their entire lives walked in, looked around, and walked out. The company's market value fell by at least $26 billion over the decade following the merger. Meanwhile, the stores kept closing. By 2010, Sears Holdings had stopped being profitable. From 2011 to 2016, the company lost a cumulative $10.4 billion. The Craftsman brand, the lifetime warranty tool line that had been synonymous with Sears since 1927, was sold to Stanley Black & Decker in 2017 for $900 million. DieHard batteries were sold to Advance Auto Parts for $200 million. Land's End, an online and catalog apparel retailer that Sears had acquired in 2001, was spun off in 2014. Every piece of the company that still had value was being peeled away and monetized, while the stores that remained open grew darker and emptier. On October 15, 2018, $134 million in debt payments came due. Sears Holdings did not have the money to pay them. That morning, the company filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy. Lampert stepped down as CEO. The filing listed 687 remaining stores and approximately 68,000 employees, a fraction of the 350,000 who had worked for Sears at its peak. The company's debts totaled approximately $5.6 billion. In the bankruptcy proceedings, unsecured creditors alleged that insiders had siphoned value away from the company on favorable terms since the merger in 2005. Lampert denied any favoritism. In January 2019, the Federal Pension Benefit Guaranty Corporation warned that Lampert's proposed acquisition of the remaining assets would create a $1.7 billion gap in the employee pension fund, a shortfall that American taxpayers would ultimately have to cover. 90,000 former Sears and Kmart employees and retirees were owed pension payments. In February 2019, a bankruptcy judge approved a $5.2 billion plan by Lampert's fund to purchase the remaining assets, preserving roughly 425 stores and 45,000 jobs. The judge implored Lampert to take action that would be meaningful to Sears workers and creditors. The new entity was called Transformco. The name was aspirational. The reality was liquidation in slow motion. The stores continued to close. The Sears Auto Centers shut down. The last Kmart on the American mainland closed. Transformco, which does not report financial results, shifted its focus to managing and selling real estate, the thing the stores had been sitting on all along. In 2009, a London-based insurance broker called Willis Group leased 140,000 square feet in the Tower at 233 South Wacker Drive. The contract included naming rights. On July 16, 2009, the Sears Tower became the Willis Tower. Chicagoans, by and large, refused to call it that, but the name on the building no longer belonged to the company that built it. Richard Sears made $5,000 selling watches to railroad men in 1886 and built a company that touched nearly every household in the country. Julius Rosenwald risked $21 million of his own money to save it. Robert Wood read the census and saw the suburbs before the suburbs existed. Somewhere in that arc, between the watches and the Tower, between the catalog and the bankruptcy, the company that always knew where Americans were going lost track of where it was. 5 Sears stores remain open, 2 of them in Florida. One of those has been operating since 1954. In the old Homan Avenue complex, where 20,000 workers once filled orders in a building that stretched across 40 acres of Chicago's west side, the original 14-story Sears Tower, the first one, the one nobody outside Chicago remembers, has been renovated into a community center. The marble floors are polished. The windows are clean. The name on the door is different. If you stand on the upper floors and look east toward the skyline, you can see the other tower, the tall one, the famous one, still rising above everything around it. Still the third tallest building in the Western Hemisphere, still bearing the silhouette that Fazlur Khan designed from 9 bundled tubes, still catching the light off Lake Michigan in the late afternoon. The building was designed to last. The company was not.